One of the most common and simultaneously one of the most overlooked occurrences in competitive Pokemon is the player who feels stuck at a certain skill level. The player who is at a certain level of competence, who understands the game, but doesn't know what the next step is that they have to take in order to improve past that level. You see this all the time. People will say, "Oh, I just don't know how to get better. I can't seem to get past where I currently am." However you want to quantify that. You'll commonly see people say, "Oh, I can't get past a certain ladder rating." That's probably the most common. But it can also be things like, "Oh, I can't seem to get past round 4 in a tournament," because that's when you start getting matched up with the really good players who are left, and they just seem to be beyond my reach. It doesn't even have to be that necessarily. It can be more intangible. Like, I don't understand what it is that separates me from the best players. I don't understand how they think, why they're so consistently successful, and how they come up with the moves that they make. Like, I watch them play and they're doing such smart sequences of plays, and I'm just like, wow, how did they think of that? How did they get there? I never would have thought of that. And how do I overcome this barrier between me and that level? How do I reach the level where I'm thinking of all these different scenarios? Right? So I have very good news for you, in that the answer is not just to practice and to play a lot of games. You're not going to be able to brute force it until your brain just snaps into place and you instinctually understand this kind of stuff. No, that's not the case at all. It'd be very stupid if it was the case, but no. The answer is not just laddering until your eyes bleed and you put your head through a wall and you transcend this physical realm and you suddenly understand the mysteries of the universe, like why are we here and why should I use Draco Meteor when I could just double switch instead. Stuff like that is not it. What you're going to want to do is analyze a bunch of games. And the next question, of course, is, okay, how do I do that? Because a lot of players tend to play on instinct and, their feel for the game, and some players have more of a natural feel for the higher levels of the game than others. But it's nothing that you cannot reach. There are not that many choices in a Pokemon game, so it's often as simple as just asking the right questions, such as, what happens if I make this move? Right? And that's the basic idea of this video, to give you, not just give you the answers, like Gary the Gengar should use Stealth Rock on this turn because Gary the Gengar should use Stealth Rock on this turn. It should be, what happens if Gary the Gengar uses Stealth Rock on this turn? It's not about, having the answers. It's about knowing what questions to ask so that when you're playing the game yourself, no one else is going to be there to give you the answers, unless you're cheating. But if you're playing on your own, nobody else is going to tell you what to do. You're going to need to think of it on your own. So, think of it like school or higher education or whatever. The places you go when you actually want to learn how to do something. And if you really want to learn how to do something, you don't just look up the answers. You learn the processes and you learn what questions to ask, and that will lead you to the right answers. So that's what this video is about, and we're going to take this game that I thought was very cool, and I think it will make a great learning tool. So when you're following along with this game, then you're going to be wanting to ask yourself the questions of, what happens if so-and-so? What needs to be done in order for either player to win? What are the threats on both sides? So, and before we get into that, the games you want to be analyzing, yes, you want to be analyzing your own games for sure. You're going to want to put aside your ego and forget that you lost this game because you missed Draco Meteor, right? I'm sure you did, and that sucks, but that's not important. What you want to be focusing on is why the game went wrong, if it did, which it usually did. Nobody plays perfectly, 99.9% of the time. I'm sure that you've seen someone in a tournament play really well and then brag after about how perfectly they played. Even those definitely had things that could be improved, Even when some players are really in the zone, then after, if they're honest with themselves, they look at the game and they're like, hey, I actually could have done this on turn 4 or whatever. So there's always something you could do to improve. It might not even be a battle thing, it might be a team builder thing, but for now, let's just stick with battle. Start simple. So you're going to want to look at your own games and say, oh, well, this game started to fall apart because of this and that. And going over this battle with me will hopefully give you the thought processes necessary so you know what to be looking for when you're doing this analysis. But you don't just want to be looking at your own games. You want to be looking at high-level tournament games, because if you want to watch those high-level players doing all their amazing things they do, then you can be wowed, like, wow, that triple switch to get up a second layer of spikes to put the opposing Pokemon in 3 KO range, that was just genius, right? You can just wow at it, but then it's also nothing that you can't understand if you analyze it. You can sit back and be like, wow, that was genius, or you can think about, oh, that was really smart, here's why it happened, and here's how I can incorporate this into my game. Or even if you don't necessarily like the style of play, you can also say, that's a good way of thinking, and it will open up your mind to start thinking about the game in a way that will lead you to find the answers better. Because that's what a lot of not improving is about, is I don't know what the answers are and I don't know how to find them. And that's why you want to ask the questions, the right questions. Because if you don't know what questions to ask, how are you going to find the answers? You might stumble onto them by accident, but you're not going to be able to do it consistently. So that's why in a game like Pokemon, then the result is not, it tends to not be as important as the way you play the game. Because the game can do silly stuff, and this battle we're going to watch is actually a fantastic example of that. So, yeah, analyze your own games, but also analyze those high-level games where the players are really firing on all cylinders and really doing well, and then by understanding them, you open the doors for yourself to be able to play at that same level, in that same register. Because you can say, oh, I play decently, but those guys are on another level. And then you say, oh, well, what are those guys doing? That is so high level. And then when you understand that, you can do it yourself. All right, I hope I've hammered that point home well enough. So let's get to, well, actually, the team preview, first of all. Since there are now more generations with team preview than without, disgusting. So doing it without team preview, that's another skill. And I guess I'll have to make a separate video on that. Well, I have to make a couple separate videos on team preview and non-team preview stuff. But one of the things that's obviously necessary is that, yes, in most metagames, you are going to make your decisions based on your knowledge of the tier and what Pokemon do, in general, and what they do when they're paired with each other. Like, if a Dragonite is paired with Magnezone in Gen 5, it's not going to have Fire Punch, because Magnezone removes the need to Fire Punch. By KOing Ferrothorn and the rare scene Scizor and Fortress and Skarmory, obviously that's way more common. So things like that. So metagame knowledge is important. So that's first of all. But let's say you understand the metagame, right? Let's say you've gotten acquainted with the tier Gen 5 OU and you know roughly what's going to happen. So we'll just quickly run off the sets. Gary's team, you're going to have Slowbro, Moonga's doing some bulky stuff, not really a bunch of surprises. Bulky Chople Tar to handle things like Alakazam and Reuniclus. I guess this is a good place to start analyzing. You ask the question, in Team Preview, it's like, oh, well, what threats, or how are they answering certain threats? And on Gary's team, then if the T-Tar isn't Choppleberry, then top threat Alakazam will just absolutely shatter it. So it's probably going to be Choppleberry. And then you're going to say, Terrakian's going to do, some SD or Choice Band stuff. The Rocker's probably going to be Lando, feasibly Excadrill, but probably Lando. And then, Excadrill might be Scarf or Lando might be Scarf, one of the two. But generally nothing too crazy. Whereas on Shake It Up's team, because he's playing on that alt from an anime I don't recognize, then you've got your Physical Onslaught. You got four Pokemon that can learn Swords Dance, and Starmie to spin for Dragonite, and very likely some focus, definitely on Terrakion, very possibly on Garchomp as well. And if you've kept up with the Black and White metagame, you know the Scizor is probably SD Pursuit to better help with things like Latios and Alakazam that would otherwise be a pain. Yeah, so at Team Preview, you analyze first what the sets are going to be, and you don't have to, spend most of your time or at Team Preview doing this, obviously, writing it down or whatever, because with enough experience, you will learn to do it instinctually. But it is good to run down in your head, just so you have the information there already, so when you have to think about it later, then it's more immediate. You're not thinking of, like, if it's turn 3 or whatever, and you're starting to think, I wonder what that, Garchomp might be doing. It's better to think at Team Preview, all right, it's likely that so-and-so. So then you're saving time. That's really important. So we got a bunch of physical attackers on Shake's side and, some bulky stuff with its own threats on Gary's side. So now what we want to do is analyze how these teams interact with each other insofar as what are their win conditions. I generally don't like this expression, but a lot of people like it. So what are the win conditions, i.e. what is threatening to the opposing side? How are they going to win? This doesn't just mean which setup sweeper wins first, because if you're playing a stall team, then they're not going to be bombarding you with setup sweepers. Their win condition might just be, I'm going to sit on everything on the opposing side and run it out of PP, or I'm going to wear it down with status, or whatever. But in this case, we have offensive threats into a team with some offensive threats, but also some walls. So it shows both sides, because Gary is not going to be able to permanently wall all these Pokemon. What he's going to want to do with such a team that's balanced like this is ward off the threats long enough so that he can beat them with his own threats, right? So Terrakion, Lando, Excadrill. They obviously have their defensive utility as well, like with Lando's Intimidate, of course, and Excadrill has some nice resistances. But for the most part, he's going to be using his defensive core to ward off these threats, not permanently, just long enough so that he can KO them in return. So Shake's team is not as defensively sound because it's a hyper offense team, so it can't afford walls. But if it's working well, then it doesn't need to wall everything because it's bowling you over first. So we understand how these teams play. Shake plays at a faster pace, Gary plays at a slower pace. And how are they going to crash into each other? Now we start looking at the individual threats. So the threats on Shake's side are, the Swords Dancers. You got Chomp, Loom, Scizor. Terrakion might have SD, but it's primarily going to be the Rocker most of the time. So it could also SD though. And then DD Dragonite. So he's got all these physical threats. And Gary's answer to these physical threats, Lando and Slowbro are the obvious ones. But Amoonguss is unique in that it checks Breloom. But Amoonguss is also what prevents the rest of the Pokemon from getting destroyed by Starmie immediately. Amoonguss and T-Tar. And now that we see it like this, we start to see how the chips are going to fall in an actual game scenario. Especially once you start mixing in chip damage from things like Stealth Rock and Sand. So yeah, Amoonguss is going to stop Starmie maybe, but it has to be careful of Ice Beams, God forbid Psyshock. So it's going to have to pivot around that, but, T-Tar can't just switch right into Hydro Pump with Rocks Up because it'll get destroyed, and then it's even worse off. So it's going to be a delicate dance of rocks and sand and pivoting around Starmie, even though Starmie is not, like, the physical threat. And once the physical threat, once Starmie opens up, Amoonguss might be too weak to fend off Breloom. Then Breloom starts getting scary because Lando still kind of checks it, but not too well. And then once Lando is weakened, then, Slowbro is also good into things like Chomp and Terrakion, but it's also not ironclad, especially, once they start boosting. It can get really nasty. Scizor is fairly threatening in its own right. So you see that it's not just about once I get Garchomp on the field, the game is over. I guess Volcarona would be a more apt Pokemon for such an example because it's so boom or bust. But a lot of the time you're not going to have this. If your opponent's team is competent, then you're not going to have a Pokemon that they automatically lose to once you hit the field. The game is more nuanced than that. So It's about, oh, I'm going to get D-Knight in, and I'm going to DD, and I'm going to rip a chunk out of Slowbro and something else if I can get it in while Multiscale is active before Sand goes up, for example. You know, because, and then once Slowbro takes a hit, then my Garchomp is scarier, and then Garchomp poses a threat because it outspeeds everything besides Terrakion and the Scarfer, whatever that is, and it threatens everything really hard, and so on and so forth. And you see how the bricks might start tumbling. You can also start planning things once the game starts more concretely, as in you can arrange your moves for more positioning. But if you want a video about positioning, then check out my video called Prediction is Overrated. So, yeah, that's another example. So, like, let's take the D-Knight DDing example. If D-Knight DDs, then you're going to... with its multi-scale attack, then Slowbro can't answer it because +1 Outrage rips it up real hard, and Ice Beam won't KO through multi-scale, and it can't T-Wave because of Lumberry. So it's not going to, you know, automatically win the game, but it's going to make significant progress. And progress is the name of the game. You want to be doing as much as possible to break through your opponent's defenses. Or, you know, if you're using a defensive team, then, you know, lock onto your opponent's threats and remove them so that you can wall them safely. You know, same idea, just more defensively. But in this case, we're going with the Shake side of the game, because, and we'll switch to the team preview if we like. If we want to go with the Shake side of the game, then we're looking to break through the opponent's defenses and how to set up those conditions. Right? So how do we get D-Knight on the field without rocks up and without multi-scale and without Sand in the picture? Well, we can't guarantee the Sand thing, because if Gary leads off with T-Tar, there's nothing we can do to prevent that. You know, if he leads off with T-Tar, he leads off with T-Tar, and there's Sand the whole game. And D-Knight will have one turn of multi-scale, but as Slowbro switches in, it will lose the multi-scale, and it'll be an Ice Beam range, and yeah, so on. However, what you can do is plan for T-Tar having Sand up. For example, let's say your rocker is Terrakion. Terrakion, if Gary wants to lead off with T-Tar, fine, but it'll immediately switch out because Terrakion is going to lead off, and it's going to get up rocks, and it's going to prevent Gary from getting up rocks with Taunt, which is what makes it likelier that it doesn't have SD, as it rather has a Taunt to prevent rocks from things like Gliscor. So, okay, yeah, and if Gary doesn't lead off with T-Tar to get Terrakion in, if Gary doesn't lead off with T-Tar to get that Sand for D-Knight, then that means that there's no Sand for D-Knight, so that makes D-Knight more threatening. Hopefully you're following. If you need clarification on anything, just leave a comment and I'll try to explain. But you know what you need, and you're going to try and play to fulfill that need. You know, whether that's, I need to keep this Pokemon healthy for the opposing Scarf Excadrill, for example. You know, let's say that Shake really needs to keep D-Knight and Breloom healthy, so, or useful in some way. Or one of Breloom or D-Knight, let's say, or else Scarf Excadrill will just click Earthquake with Sandforce, with the Sandforce boost, and it's going to clean up the entire team with, you know, minimal chip on Scizor, right? And with Stealth, with like Sash is broken and stuff. Minimal chip on Scizor and Garchomp, and yeah. So things like that. That's your defensive need, but offensively, you need to get up rocks. You need to start boosting and doing a lot of damage. Plus, with the T-Tar thing, another benefit is, okay, if T-Tar does get Sand, fine. D-Knight might not beat Slowbro one-on-one, but Slowbro also takes Sand, so D-Knight is going to be able to sting it more. The hit D-Knight leaves Slowbro with is going to be more long-lasting, because the effective Regenerator is not as powerful as outside of Sand. So, hopefully, remember, in the case of this game, this is more about considering all the options and how these things interact with each other. And remember, you're not just going to be able to copy-paste examples from this game into your own play. You know, even if you play Black and White, then it might not necessarily be it. But it's generally getting yourself to consider the interactions of Pokemon. You know, what Pokemon switches into what. You know, Slowbro switches into D-Knight, and Lando switches into D-Knight, you know, because those are the things that actually check it. If Terrakion switches into D-Knight as it DDs, then you're like, okay, thanks for the free outrage, you know, at +1. So, things like that. Right, so that's from the offensive perspective. Now we switch back to Gary. What does Gary need to do? Gary needs to exert his own pressure. We don't know what his rocker is. So he needs to get up rocks to break sashes and pressure D-Knight, you know, get sand, passive damage, all that. And he also needs to be careful around the things like Starmie, things like Garchomp, and basically wear down the offensive team to where he can clean up with his, let's say, Scarf Excadrill, because it's more likely than Scarf Lando nowadays. So, right? So, you know, dance around the Breloom, dance around the D-Knight, dance around the Chomp, and, you know, because once those are dealt with in some way, then Scarf Sandforce EQ is going to clean up real hard, and he has good defensive tools, right? Okay, so yeah, and also the sand thing, like it applies to everything. It applies to even like Starmie as well. Like if Amoonguss is trying to pivot around Starmie and it's outside of sand, then it's going to regenerate a lot more easily than in sand. So again, you can't guarantee that Shake or that Gary won't lead off the T-Tar and get the sand, but you can punish him for doing so. And then once the sand goes up, because a game plan is not about rigidly following one thing necessarily. Like, okay, there are conditions like if let's just assume this is the case. If Breloom dies, I lose to Excadrill, right? So that you have to do, right? Because otherwise it will just click EQ X amount of times and you will lose, right? But for other Pokemon, their value can change, you know, on a turn-to-turn basis. You know, something like D-Knight might be less valuable at the beginning of a game because it's facing Skarmory and Slowbro and Unaware Quagsire or something ridiculous. You know, throw Tangrowth in there, and then suddenly your opponent starts throwing away their Pokemon's health, or it starts they start taking damage from something else, and suddenly your D-Knight becomes more valuable. So it's important to not decide your win condition at team preview and then rigidly abide by it no matter what. You have to, it's a fine balance you have to strike of having a plan, knowing what you need, but also being able to adapt. And this is why it's important to ask yourself questions. And if you're ever stuck and you're like, I don't know what question to ask myself, you just ask yourself, what happens if I do this? And you do this for every single move, and you'll find strategies you will never have thought of before. You know, like I'll use an example from an old test game I had with my buddy a long time ago. We were testing to make sure his matchup in Gen 5 was good against Rain, I believe. I don't remember the exact specifics, but basically he switched his Latios into my Latios as I used Surf. And at first I was thinking that was really risky, and then I thought about it, and I realized if I Draco Meteor that Latios, he sets up with so-and-so, and I might not lose on the spot, but I'll have a very difficult time to recover from it, right? So he realized I don't need Latios, and if I switch it into Draco Meteor, I will wind up abusing it. Things like that. You know, it's not always going to be as simple as I have Ferrothorn, I switch it into Latios. Because he had a Ferrothorn. It was at full health. He could have switched it into Latios. But that wouldn't have gotten him as close to winning as switching to Latios there was. Because if Latios got sacrificed, then whatever it was, let's say Thundurus, just for example's sake, set up and would have, you know, made it very difficult for me to win. And if I Surf, as I did, and as was more likely, then no harm done. Latios is in for free. That's great. So, by really considering every option, even because a lot of the time people will think, oh, it's a 50-50 because it's either that move or that move. And a lot of the times, if you really consider every option, even the one that doesn't seem intuitive, then you're going to find ways to win that you wouldn't have considered otherwise. Just by asking yourself the question, what happens if I do this move, even if it doesn't seem obvious? You know, it's always, do I stay in an attack or do I switch to Landorus, right? And then it's like, well, do I stay and use one attack? Do I stay in and use Stealth Rock, or do I switch to Landorus? Well, what if you stay in and use, I don't know, Knockoff instead? What does that change? And little things like this, you know, or if you switch, why do you have to switch to Landorus? What happens if you switch to Latios instead? So, really considering every option Obviously, this is difficult to do in a timer situation, so if you really want to practice this for yourself, I recommend, getting a friend and testing with them with the timer off and really just going through every single option you have as the game gets more complicated, and from there you will start to see things in a different light. Okay, so what lead would you select? Just think about it for a few seconds. What lead would you go with for both players, Shake and Gary alike? I know if I'm Shake, I'm leading off with Terrakion because, Terrakion likes these matchups. It's just going to get up rocks, and if the spinner is Excadrill, especially Scarf Excadrill, then they're going to be digging in for without much contest. And Taunt Terrak will also prevent opposing rocks. So for me, Terrak is a no-brainer. And why is Terrak a no-brainer? Because there's nothing that Gary can really do to stop it. Nothing is going to really stop it from doing its job of preventing rocks and then getting rocks. Also, it doesn't even need to taunt because Starmie can spin. That's, not life or death. Terrakion's primary objective is to get rocks, right? So he can lead off with, and this is why you're wondering as Gary what your options are. And it's pretty much Lando or Slowbro, because all the other options are bad. So you can, it doesn't have to be as, I have, performed a meticulous analysis and I've determined, it's like, okay, well, if you want to simplify it, what am I not doing? What am I 100% not going to go with here because it's bad? You're not going to lead Terrak into Terrak. Amoonguss, maybe, but also why? Because you're not damaging it as much. And you think, well, if I lead with Amoonguss, why wouldn't I just lead with Slowbro? Because I can just scald the Terrakion and ruin it a lot more than with Giga Drain. You're not leading off. I mean, if you want to lead off with T-Tar to get sand, then so be it, but you're going to be on the back foot against Terrak turn 1. Unless you want to lead off with T-Tar and stay in and Superpower, which... And that's exactly what I'm talking about, because the more I think about it, the more I'm like, okay, I don't actually think staying in with T-Tar and superpowering the Terrakion is a good move. But think about it like this. T-Tar is not nearly as valuable as most of its teammates beyond its sand. You're going to struggle to get up the sand later on, because T-Tar doesn't switch into much. Actually, T-Tar doesn't switch into anything safely on Shake's team. You're pretty much just going to throw it away as death fodder to get up sand later. And if you want sand, for like Loom and D-Knight and Starmie, then wouldn't you want it immediately? Especially because with Chople, you are going to live a Terrak. Actually, no, I don't remember if you live Terrak close combat or not with Chople. It's been too long. Unboosted, I mean. So, check the calc before you decide that's a good move or not. I don't think you do, now that I think about it. It's too strong. So yeah, but in the imaginary worlds where T-Tar does live Terrak CC with Chople Berry, it becomes a viable option, right? And you're not going to do Excadrill because you might just, lose your Excadrill. That's how you're going to win the game. And even if you attack it down to the Sash and it gets up rocks, then Shake has the momentum. So you want to limit the momentum that Shake has and damage as much as possible. Right, so it's going to be Lando or Slowbro pretty much, and between the two of those, Slowbro can potentially cripple Terrakion with T-Wave if it wants to go for that, or a Scald Burn, and that makes getting rid of its rocks a lot easier. So, if possible, because getting rid of rocks makes his team a lot harder to break through. So it's looking like it's going to be Terrak and Slowbro, and I've seen this game before, so those are the leads, but rather than just thinking, oh wow, he's so smart for figuring it out, more to think about how why those leads are good. It's not like you have the answer, right? But were those good leads? Were they the best? Maybe it was better for Gary to lead off with Lando and use U-turn and go to Scarf Excadrill and threaten to KO Terrakion and then spin on the switch or something. Something like that could have been a better move if you think about it long enough. But this video is already pretty long. So, yeah, so that's why I think those moves were made. I think Lando U-turn into Excadrill is a valid move, but it's also a tough one to make. Because locking into a move that early against a team this threatening can potentially get really out of hand. So, yeah. Yeah, also Excadrill locking into EQ gives D-Knight and free switch with rocks and with no sand, and Excadrill locking into Iron Head gives Scizor a free SD, and seeing as Excadrill is actually kind of Gary's best Scizor check, then that might not be the move. That pretty much guarantees you're going to take heavy, heavy damage, if not lose a poke, because Lando is not really a counter to it at all. So, with that logic, we see, okay, no, Lando U-turn into Excadrill might not be the move. Because what happens if... and this is where you start planning it out turn by turn. I stand with Terrakion. If Iron Head, then I Scizor and I KO something. And then the Excadrill can't spin on me because then I KO it instead. And I've KO'd 2 Pokemon. And then I'm really off to the races. And you know, I'm still going to KO other things as well. You know, and then once Excadrill KOs me with EQ, then I go to D-Knight and I set up with that, and I blast through, you know, the T-Tar or the Slowbro. Another way to think of T-Tar is if I switch to T-Tar on D-Knight, then I sacrifice it for, if I have Rock Slide or Ice Beam, then I can use it to check D-Knight, because I'll break multi-scale. So in that sense, that's what T-Tar's greatest value might be, going to that instead of Slowbro immediately, so that you can check multi-scale. So that, see, as I think about it more, the more I think, oh, T-Tar is a little more valuable in that it becomes kind of a de facto D-Knight check, in that it switches in and removes multi-scale, and potentially checks it if it has Rock Slide or Ice Beam, which I think many T-Tar should to help with Thunderous Therian. But the problem with that might be that you also might need T-Tar to pivot around Starmie if it nails a Mungus on the switch. So, we've been analyzing this for half an hour. Now let's see how the chips start to fall in an actual game scenario, right? So we're going to go with Rocks here. Obviously, you don't need to taunt this and let it die. Just get Rocks, and if you get burned, so what? You can still make it work. But now you're going to go to Starmie because it's the only Pokemon that's not ruined by Scald Burn, and if you Stone Edge Slowbro, then you don't do anything. You know, Gary would love that because he's going to regenerate that off easily, and then the spin goes off if he can get it off, and it's permanent. You can't threaten it back. Because right now, what Shake can do if Excadrill comes in is go to Terrakion and sacrifice it to whatever move, and if it attacks, then fine, rocks are still up, and he's still got pressure because he wants to play fast, so he doesn't need to keep rocks off forever, just, you know, long enough for them to do their job offensively. And if Shake spins, then that can also be exploited. He can you know, set up rocks again. If if Gary spins, that can also be exploited, because if he just keeps spinning, eventually Terrakion might just use CC and take Excadrill out, and then he can get up rocks because he's faster than everything else, except for speed tie with Gary's Terrak. So yeah, so he can do things like that. So, Starmie comes in, gets its balloon popped. That might be significant, but, you know, it's worth... And gets burned, but it's also worth not letting Terrak die or risking something else to that burn. Especially because nothing else besides Breloom threatens Slowbro at full health like this. So it was definitely Starmie there. So, Gary just playing it safe. Now, here, Shake is going to go for Thunderbolt on the Amoonguss switch. No, sorry, he goes for Hydro Pump. I'm sorry. I thought he said he went for Thunderbolt. For some reason in my mind, he said it was... No, that was a good move. For some reason, I had in my mind that he was going to T-Bolt just in case the Slowbro decided to stay in and slack off or something, because it could regenerate off most of the damage. And then I realized that's a silly risk, because you really need that Slowbro. So Shake goes for Hydro Pump just so Tyranitar can't switch in for free and KO it. And instead of Mungus comes in and takes a Hydro Pump with Rock, so that's significant. So you could make the argument that you T-Bolt because, I guess maybe if you really think Scarf Lando or Excadrill is coming in there, but that's never the case. That's so risky and just not worth it. So it's either Mungus or T-Tar, and you could make the argument you use Ice Beam there, if anything, if you're predicting the Slowbro to switch out, as opposed to T-Bolt. You use Ice Beam there because if T-Tar switches in, then it still takes the Hydro Pump afterwards, but and then it can't check D-Knight anymore, I mean, Sand will be up, but Slowbro will be forced to take it, and that'll help the chips fall for Garchomp. But at the same time, you could also say, well, Amoonguss switching in is better than T-Tar. Amoonguss switching into Hydro is better than T-Tar switching into Ice Beam, because then T-Tar can remove Starmie, and that is going to disrupt your game plan a little bit more than Amoonguss switching into Hydro Pump. Because if Amoonguss switches into Hydro Pump, then you sacrifice it to Ice Beam, and then Breloom becomes a lot more of a threat. And, here's the big one, it also means that Sand is not yet up, and that makes D-Knight more threatening than it is otherwise. So, I can see the merit of both plays, and Gary just went with Amoonguss because it's on the safer side, because even if it gets Ice Beamed, then he can still regenerate out and go to T-Tar, and also the threat of T-Tar helps against Amoonguss. Against getting Ice Beamed on the switch. So that's the general idea. It depends on how you want to play. Do you want to punish It's like, do you want T-Tar to be punished for setting up that Sand that's going to hamper your D-Knight? Fine. And if you... Well, I'm not going to repeat myself even more, but hopefully this is getting the gears flowing in your head. So Shake stays in, Ice Beams, and does a good chunk. Gets healed off by Giga Drain. But and with Regenerate, that's going to be nice. But Rocks are also going to help. And what's even more crucial is that now here comes Garchomp, and that is going to be really threatening because Amoonguss can't stay in here, because if it stays in, it risks damage, and then Breloom will rip everything else up. So I got to switch here. In comes Slowbro, and Shake takes advantage of this and SDs. Got to play aggressive on things like that, because if you just EQ and flail into defensive Pokemon like this, this is especially important if you're behind, because if you just play the game the way it's playing out in its current trajectory, you're just going to lose. So you got to be aggressive. But even on a hyper-offensive team, then you're always in need of that aggressive play to actually force the issue and actually make something happen. Because if you EQ there, then there's no pressure being applied at all. No, you got to SD on that switch, because even if Amoonguss stays in, which is not going to, unless, you know, just dying to Breloom is in Gary's interest, then... Yeah, what's the worst Amoonguss can do there? You know, Stun Spore, HP Ice, you're still ripping a huge chunk out of something afterwards. There's no way you can avoid it. So, SD there covers the likelier Slowbro switch, and even if Amoonguss stays in and does something dumb, then you're still going to be fine. So, SD, EQ does a ton to Slowbro, and Ice Beam, but it hangs on because of the Sash. So, there's the Tarak lead paying dividends, preventing the opposing rocks. And now Garchomp is even more threatening. You know, if it wasn't Sash, it could have been Yachi, but Sash helps with things like Latios as well. So, or like Rain Keldeo. So, Chomp, insanely threatening at +2. Now Slowbro is damaged, because if Lando came in there, then it would have been a similar story. It struggles to switch into, well, deal with, well, +1 Garchomp instead of +2. But it's still going to take really heavy damage, and either of Lando or Slowbro getting damaged there is really big for these other physical sweepers, well, D-Knight and Scizor alike, because it's usually Pursuit over Bug Bite. So either of them being damaged is really big for Dragonite, and making the chips fall, because these other Pokemon are not that great against it. So... And Breloom is a certain degree of threat as more chips fall and the game changes, because it's not just Garchomp did a big chunk of damage to Slowbro now. It's Garchomp's going to do a big chunk of damage to multiple Pokemon, and we're going to see how Gary responds to that, and then adapt the plan based on that. So, Slowbro didn't took this damage. It's going to regenerate some of it off, you know, with lefties helping out, but Rocks impedes it a little bit. It's going to regenerate some of it off, but it's no longer really comfortable switching into D-Knight, so there's going to be an awkward dance around that, actually, but first there's going to be an awkward dance around the Garchomp. So, Gary decides to sacrifice Tyranitar here, get the Sand, so D-Knight is dealt with in that way, in terms of multiscale. But it also means that Slowbro's regenerator is hampered, Amoonguss's regenerator is hampered, and that's the game shifting. D-Knight no longer quite as threatening without multiscale helping it against things like Sandforce, Rock Slide, Excadrill, or Slowbro Ice Beam, or, you know, well, it's still going to take Lando T HP Ice, but the damage it's going to leave on Slowbro is even more significant. So, of course, you still have to keep in mind that Lando T is not sand affected. But Garchomp got a KO, and Gary is going to go to Terrakion to pick up a KO in return, not opting to go for Scarf Excadrill's Rapid Spin KO because of what Shake can do, which is the Terrakion thing from earlier. Go to Terrak on spin, or another move, and if it's another move, then free setup, and if it's spin, then he's eventually going to come out on top of that because it's very abusable. So instead, Gary goes to Terrak, which is less abusable. Just goes for the close combat and takes some rough skin, so that's helpful. Definitely going to be in range for the priority from Loom and, what's it called? Scizor now. And I believe now Shake goes to Dragon... No, he goes to Breloom. Okay. I thought he was going to go to Dragonite because if it's banded, then it switches out, and if it's not banded, then he's not going to be able to KO the D-Knight, and then he can make stuff happen. But he went to Breloom instead, so just so this video doesn't go forever, I will leave to you, the viewer, do you think it was better to go to D-Knight there? Because Slowbro is going to be, 39, plus 33 is going to bring it to 72, minus 12 is going to bring it to 60, and I believe that is it. I think that's a roll for +1 Outrage. So it's very likely it would have been KO'd there, but it's likelier that Lando comes in, and Lando won't beat it one-on-one, but it's going to intimidate, draw an Outrage, maybe it DDs again. It depends on how you want to play it, and this is why I don't want to go too much into it, because there's so much you can do. You can DD, and if Lando comes in, you DD again, and then you Outrage, and then you because if you DD again, you also outspeed the Scarf Excadrill, and you punish that, and if Excadrill then winds up being the the Outrage Sponge, then Scizor is likelier to win. And you're still going to, and before that even happens, you're going to really cram Lando T as well, and then once Lando T is weakened, then it's just Amoonguss standing between Breloom and Victory, and Amoonguss is also not super good as well. So I think Dragonite was a very feasible option there, because I guess if you're afraid that a Scarf Excadrill would switch in as D-Knight DD'd, then it's a valid fear. So I will leave that up to you. That's the question of the day, or whatever those YouTubers do. Would you have gone to D-Knight on turn 9? But instead he's going to go to this thing, to Breloom, and he is going to threaten Mach Punch against the -2 Terrak, and Gary switches out and goes to Amoonguss because it's safe. Or it seems safe anyway. So that's the thing. Like, yes, Terrakion is not that valuable, but there's no reason he might need it for death fodder, because this is remember, Gary's plan is to survive long enough for his offensive Pokemon, his Excadrill, to be able to finish the game off. And it's a lot of times with hyper offensive stuff that is very weak to passive damage, even just Sandstorm, then a lot of the time you just kind of wait for them to wear themselves out from things like rocks and sand, and even like their own life orbs. That's very common. So you sometimes just need that extra sacrifice. Rather than switching Lando right in, maybe you switch in Lando on the D-Knight DD, and then you force Outrage or whatever. And then rather than going to Excadrill, then you can go to Terrakion. You just need that extra sacrifice. So it's good to have that Terrakion sacrifice just for general, just so it's a 5-4 game instead of a 4-4 game, especially when Amoonguss seems safe into Breloom, as it usually is. Now, Shake takes advantage of that with an SD. Another really, really great play. You have to pull those triggers. It's really hard to, but you have to. So, if you're using a team like this, of course. So he SDs, and +2 superpower just pulverizes the Amoonguss, which shocked everyone. I don't know if that's like fist plate or something. I think it has to be, because that's so much damage. And now suddenly the game is turned. So yeah, Terrakion doesn't beat any of Shake's Pokemon I guess it beats D-Knight one-on-one, but it's tough to isolate that matchup like that. So you just want the sacrifice. Now, of course, what's more threatening is that Gary's own Landorus Therian is also quite an excellent win condition of its own, because yes, it's not a counter to Scizor, but nor is Scizor an answer to Landorus Therian. Same with D-Knight. Terrakion doesn't want to switch in, and it's for Shake. Now it's not so much. see, look how the game has shifted. It's not I need to break through the opponent's defenses, because he's already done that. Gary is not withstanding his assault anymore. Now it's shifted to I need to survive against this Landorus Therian, because otherwise it is going to sweep me. So what does that involve? That involves keeping Breloom out of HP Ice range. That involves keeping Scizor healthy. Not switching D-Knight in until after a KO, so it has a turn of multi-scale. Things like that. So what move do you make against the Lando T here? So I guess you could feasibly stay in Bullet Seed here and get another KO. But the problem is you're afraid of HP Ice or U-turn, because U-turning out into another sack and then Lando comes in again. And I mean, hey, the thing is, I'm thinking Bullet Seed seems kind of good, because if another Pokemon gets sacrificed, then that's one less Pokemon that Gary has to withstand Scizor and Dragonite, so you can more feasibly plan a win with them. So Bullet Seed here seems okay, unless U-turn threatens a KO at -1 defense, but that seems unrealistic. However, another argument is, look, Breloom will still be threatening even if you switch it out. When it comes back in, Breloom will still threaten that Bullet Seed. And more importantly, it's more valuable in this sense than Terrakion, because at this point Terrakion is just death fodder. Breloom threatens the Mach Punch on the Scarf Excadrill, and it threatens Slowbro with a Bullet Seed KO, even without boosting, which the other Pokemon do not, if we assume that the Scizor is the standard set of Pursuit over Bug Bite. And so in that sense, you could say, yes, Bullet Seed could have the cascading effect of forcing a KO so the other Pokemon can clean up, but you're doing that and preserving Terrakion while doing it, and do you really need to preserve the Terrakion? Now, before you make this choice, I would also calc U-turn, see how much it's doing, because HP Ice isn't going to KO from here. U-turn is, I think it's going to do more damage. Either way, you want to preserve Breloom for the Scarf EQ locked Excadrill, for example, and you want to threaten Slowbro, and more than that, you just don't want to preserve it, Terrakion over it. So I assume that Terrakion's going to come in here. It does, and it switches in on an HP Ice. See, that's another thing. Before Terrakion goes down, it's going to fire off a Stone Edge and hit something real nice. Now, that's a lot of damage. So now Lando is even better. So that's a great move. You could even make the argument, hey, maybe Gary should have EQ'd there because he knows Breloom is going to get preserved. And it also hits very hard at -1. It's going to 2 a KO. And it prevents Terrakion from doing exactly what it just did, because Lando T checking Terrakion is usually because of Intimidate. So in a one-on-one, that naked Stone Edge does a lot of damage. So that was really nicely done from Shake. Pivoting Terrakion like that, chunking the Lando T. And, and if Excadrill switches into that Stone Edge, then it's going to lock itself into a move. As Lando has officially revealed itself as lefties. So, Excadrill is going to be the Scarf one. Yeah, now, Scizor comes in the one-on-one. Also, very important, if you're in a because analyzing in a battle after the fact is all well and good, but the end goal is to transfer it into battles of your own, right? And for that, I have a whole video on, I think it's called 3 Tips to Be a Better Battler or something, and in it I stress the timer, and look how these guys are using their timers. That's really, really big, because yes, there are going to be some games that are intuitive. If you have Deoxys attack against a team that has 4 Pokemon left and all of them are KO'd by Psycho Boost, and they're all slower and there's no priority or anything, then yeah, maybe it doesn't take 15 to 100 seconds to figure out, maybe I should go to Deoxys attack and Psycho Boost. But in a complicated scenario like this, then you want to think your options through more. And in this situation, Shake has elected to go to Scizor over Dragonite. I assume that's so it doesn't get pivoted around, like Terrakion gets sacrificed and then Excadrill revenges. I mean, it's like that with Scizor as well, but the revenge killing isn't as obvious. I don't know, I'm starting to run out of fuel because I'm realizing that it's past what should have been dinner time, and I've been yammering for an hour. So, again, I advise the viewer to make their own conclusions as I start to falter. But, well, let's give it a shot. So, D-Knight comes in at HP Ices, and has to outrage after one turn, then Terrakion gets sacrificed, and then Excadrill comes in, locks into... I don't know, that might even be better, because if Excadrill has to lock into Rock Slide or Iron Head to... well, it's going to be Rock Slide to Revenge Kill the D-Knight, then Breloom... Well, I guess Breloom doesn't have to... Scizor can also set up, and if Scizor sets up on the Pokemon that's meant to be checking it, then things can really get messy. I guess I guess what he wanted to avoid is Scizor sets up on Excadrill, Lando comes in to Intimidate, and then goes back to Excadrill on the Bullet Punch. But I don't know, at that point it feels like it's also... Well, then Lando has... Scizor won't take any damage if that's the case. I guess he didn't want to risk... throwing away D-Knight and then having to set up Scizor on Rock Slides, which still hit pretty hard, and make it easier to Revenge Kill it. Yeah, no, okay, I understand. He wants to still preserve the D-Knight, the forcefulness of D-Knight, especially because if you Bullet Punch the Excadrill down, then you might be able to KO it with Dragonite Extreme Speed, number one. But number two, going Scizor first preserves the D-Knight option as a viable one, as opposed to just using it, KOing something. A viable one in terms of ending the game, or coming very close to it, because if you go to D-Knight now, then Gary still has a Pokemon advantage, which, I don't know, and Scizor is also threatening as well, but see, Slowbro comes in here, and it's going to get SD KO'd by the Life Orb Pursuit, so that's the sacrifice. So, that gets crit. I don't know if that one mattered. And now Excadrill comes in, right? And yeah, no, I see it now. Yeah, so this is the thinking ahead that you need, because if Excadrill KOs Scizor with Earthquake, that gives D-Knight a completely free DD, and then it gets a KO, and then Excadrill Revenge Kills it with Rock Slide. And so let's say Terrakion gets sacrificed. Then Excadrill Revenge Kills it with Rock Slide. And then Breloom... And then Breloom, I think, will just have a very good chance at just winning. Because... Yeah, then it's the last Pokemon Breloom against Rock Slide locked... Rock Slide locked Excadrill and a Lando that will very likely... that will almost surely die to Bullet Seed, and Excadrill will be in pursuit. Will be in Mach Punch range for sure. I guess it's not guaranteed, but if you Mach Punch the Excadrill, then Breloom will be out of HP Ice range from Lando, and then you'll beat it one-on-one. But of course, if Lando switches in on the Mach Punch, then it can chip it into HP Ice range. So that's not guaranteed to work out. But actually, you don't necessarily have to do that, because, and this is why I keep saying it's important to consider all your options, if Excadrill locks into EQ, then you don't have to go to D-Knight. You can go to Breloom first, pick up a KO, and then you can have your Lando set up afterwards, and you have your D-Knight switch in, or you finish the game with Breloom, however you want to do it. But the scenario before was a little too prediction heavy with Breloom versus Exca and Lando, right? So, and that's because you go to D-Knight after Scizor gets KO'd. And if you go to Breloom after Scizor gets KO'd, then you can still, then you force it a lot more easily. So yeah, okay, I see now. So, Bullet Punch does a lot of damage, and EQ does not quite KO. And I assume that the reason it was Bullet Punch over Superpower there was because EQ had a significant chance to KO. Because otherwise you just Superpower, and I don't know. This is an interesting scenario where it might be better to not KO the Excadrill and let your Breloom set up safely. I'm not sure if that's true, but sometimes you do have situations where it's better to not KO the opposing Pokemon, and better to just get a free switch to something else. So, Exca is... Oh, it's Lefty's Exca. It's not Scarfed. Okay. Alright. So no Scarfer there. No, but he just goes for the BP and double down. So, okay, so that's notable. Now, what do you go to on this double down? I think it's Breloom because it'll 1v1 the Lando, and actually no, no, you go to Breloom because a CB Tarak I think hits too hard with Stone Edge even through multi-scale. I'd have to check the calc to be sure, but I think you go to Breloom for that reason, because yeah, you Breloom and you threaten Mach Punch, and you know this happens. So Shake just goes right for Mach Punch. He doesn't risk the Bullet Seed. I guess if you wanted, you could say stay in Bullet Seed, because if the Tarak CCs and it's banded, then D-Knight DDs and wins. But I guess he didn't want to... I mean, that is very possible. Because if D-Knight DDs, Lando's not going to take it. I guess you would... Yeah, there's Intimidate on the DD, then back to Terrakion, which takes an Outrage and neutral. Actually, I don't think it takes an Outrage neutrally at such low health. But then it might get -1'd. So, I don't know. This is why the calc is so important to inform the decisions. But if you go with the Breloom, then you're a lot less risk. If you go with Mach Punch, you're risking a lot less. As in comes Dragonite. Living the... Good lord, that HPS does a lot even with multi-scale. Wow, that did a ton. Yeah, I wonder if that's like mixed Ice Beam or something. It would make sense because I don't... Does he go for E-Speed here? I think he does. Oh, no, he goes right for Outrage. Okay. Both of them really thought about this one. Yeah, so, what Gary did there was try to dodge E-Speed, and a great move by Shake, by the way. Talk about pulling the trigger. If you go to Terrakion on E-Speed, then you have the same scenario as you did before. I mean, Lando's in HP Ice range, but it's more about pivoting into Mach Punch. Well, pivoting into Mach Punch and then getting like a second Intimidate. It's about sand damage more than the Intimidate at that point, actually. Because... you Intimidate on the Mach Punch to switch in, obviously, but that's for the purpose of sand damage, as opposed to weakening Breloom so you can survive its Bullet Seed or something. I guess maybe at that range you would also be... you might also... Actually, the Intimidate might help Terrakion stay out of Breloom Mach Punch range. So remember, so much to consider, my lord. And again, if we were... really being thorough with this, then the calc would be open and we'd be going crazy, but then we'd really be here forever. So that was a nice move. Yeah, so what Shake recognized, with a very low timer at that, was that if Gary goes to Tarak on E-Speed, then D-Knight gets KO'd, and then he would have to play a very difficult prediction game with Breloom of, do I SD on the Lando switch so that I can kill the Terrakion with Mach Punch, or do I just Mach Punch the Terrakion as it stays in? You know, not that what the Terrakion here, not that what the D-Knight here did wasn't a prediction game, but if a Lando stays in, and if Lando stays in and gets EQ, or sorry, if Lando stays in and KOs the D-Knight, then the game is still not necessarily over, because Breloom's out of Mach Punch range, or sorry, out of HP Ice range. No, that was a great move. Okay, even better. That was definitely the right move, because even if Lando stays in and goes for HP Ice, then Breloom's out of HP Ice range afterwards, threatens Bullet Seed KO. So then Gary goes to Gengar. Gary goes to Terrakion, dies to Bullet Seed. Lando comes back in, tries to HP Ice, but doesn't KO, and gets KO'd by Bullet Seed anyway. So what you want to do in this scenario is prevent Terrakion from coming in, and prevent it from making you play these stupid Mach Punch into Intimidate games for extra sand chip. And Intimidate to like leave it out of range. Actually, I don't know, if you E-Speed that Terrakion twice, I think it's going to be in -1 Mach Punch range anyway, but either way, Shake decided to prevent that from being the case and made a great move and Outrage, and Terrakion goes down, and now it's just Lando going to be finishing it off. And now it's as simple as Breloom living the HP Ice, Again, we don't have the Breloom spread, so we can't even calc that, but it does take HPIs pretty well, and it gets crit anyway, so it winds up not mattering. I did say earlier in the video that sometimes Pokemon can do that to you. Yeah, but this is a great game from both sides, and that's why I selected it as a learning tool. So, thank you so much for watching. I hope this was useful for you as a learning tool, or if you just enjoyed it and fell asleep to it, or whatever. So, yeah, I hope that it was beneficial, and I know I'm repeating myself at this point, so I'm going to call it there. I will see you in the next one.